Somewhere in a locked cabinet in Paris, a single bottle of perfume sits untouched for over 60 years. No one wears it, no one opens it, and yet people have offered small fortunes just to own it. Imagine holding a bottle of scent that no laboratory on earth can recreate, not because the formula is secret, but because the raw materials themselves no longer exist. Certain flowers were banned, certain animal ingredients were outlawed, certain factories simply closed their doors and never reopened. Most people think of perfume as something you use then throw away. But for a small, quiet community of collectors scattered across the world, perfume is something closer to art, closer to history you can hold in your hand. And like any rare art form, some bottles are worth far more sealed than sprayed. Today, we're stepping into that hidden world, the world of vintage perfume collecting, where a half-empty bottle can be worth more than the finest modern luxury fragrance sitting on a department store shelf. We'll travel through nearly a century of perfumery, from Egyptian-inspired mystery scents locked away by Guerlain, to a men's cologne that fashion insiders still mourn, to a fragrance so provocative it was once banned from certain department stores. Along the way, you'll hear about forgotten formulas, discontinued classics, and the strange psychology that drives collectors to spend extraordinary sums chasing a smell. One important note before we begin: not every old bottle is valuable. Value in this world depends on very specific things: whether the perfume is in its original formulation, how full the bottle still is, whether the box and packaging survived, the concentration of the juice itself, and whether the fragrance has been discontinued or quietly reformulated into something else entirely. Keep that in mind as we count down 10 fragrances that, for very different reasons, collectors refuse to let go of. Let's begin with number 10. Gucci Pour Homme, 2003. In the early 2000s, the men's fragrance world was dominated by loud, aggressive scents, sharp, synthetic, built for nightclubs. Then, in 2003, Gucci released something almost quiet by comparison. Gucci Pour Homme didn't shout. It whispered, sandalwood, orris, a touch of violet leaf, wrapped in a softness that felt more like an old leather-bound book than a modern cologne. It didn't dominate sales charts. It didn't need to. Fashion insiders and fragrance enthusiasts who tried it recognized something rare: a mainstream designer house releasing a scent with the restraint and complexity usually reserved for niche perfumery. When Gucci discontinued it, the reaction inside online fragrance communities was immediate. Threads and forum posts began circulating, with wearers describing it as one of the most underrated men's fragrances ever released by a major fashion house. Unlike some discontinued perfumes that fade quietly into obscurity, this one kept being mentioned, years later, by people searching for that Gucci scent from the 2000s. What makes original bottles genuinely valuable isn't just scarcity, it's specificity. Buyers in this space look for bottles that clearly predate any reformulation, ideally with intact original packaging and batch codes that confirm early production. A half-full bottle with a missing box, by contrast, holds far less appeal, even if the fragrance inside is identical. There's something almost bittersweet about Gucci Pour Homme's story. It never had a scandal. It never had a celebrity muse driving demand. It simply did something quietly excellent, disappeared from shelves, and was slowly rediscovered by people willing to dig through auction listings and vintage perfume shops to find it again. That's often how the most respected collector items are born. Not through hype, but through absence. The moment something can no longer be bought new, its story changes completely. But the next fragrance on this list carries a heavier kind of nostalgia, one tied not just to scent, but to an entire era of masculine identity. Dior Homme Original, 2005. In 2005, Dior did something unusual for a major fashion house. They built a men's fragrance around iris, an ingredient more commonly associated with delicate, powdery femininity. Composed with cocoa, leather, and that unmistakable iris heart, Dior Homme Original didn't try to smell traditionally masculine. It tried to smell elegant. The gamble worked, and it worked spectacularly. Perfumers and critics still reference the original Dior Homme as a turning point, proof that a men's fragrance could be soft, intellectual, and commercially successful all at once. It won industry awards. It influenced an entire generation of designer releases that followed it. Then, gradually, the formula began to shift. Later releases carrying similar names moved further from that original cocoa iris signature, chasing trends rather than preserving the original composition. For longtime wearers, something had been lost, not dramatically but noticeably, bottle by bottle, year by year. This is where Pour Homme Original's collector story becomes genuinely emotional rather than purely financial. Online, you'll find countless personal accounts from men describing this exact fragrance as tied to a specific chapter of their life: a wedding, a first job, a relationship. When a scent that meaningful quietly disappears from shelves, people don't just want to replace it, they want to preserve it. That emotional weight has translated into real demand for original 2005-era bottles, particularly those with clearly matching batch codes and unopened seals. As with most vintage fragrance hunting, condition changes everything. A pristine boxed bottle from the original release commands far more interest than a bottle that's been opened, partially used, or repackaged. Pour Homme Original reminds us that not every collectible perfume needs a dramatic backstory involving royalty or scandal. Sometimes, a fragrance simply captures a specific creative moment so precisely that recreating it, even by the same house, becomes almost impossible. But if Pour Homme proved a men's fragrance could be intellectual, the next perfume on our list proved a fragrance could be immortal. Ask almost anyone on the planet to name a perfume, and there's a strong chance they'll say Chanel No. 5. Released in 1921, it remains even today in continuous production, which technically makes it an unusual entry on a list about scarcity. But here's the twist collectors understand and casual buyers often don't. The Chanel No. 5 sitting on shelves today is not the same fragrance Marilyn Monroe famously said she wore to bed and nothing else. Over the decades, ingredient regulations changed. Certain natural materials, including specific animal-derived musks, were restricted or banned entirely for ethical and safety reasons. Chanel, like every major house, had to reformulate. The core identity of No. 5 remains recognizable, but vintage Parfum concentration bottles, particularly those produced before major reformulation waves, are prized specifically because they capture an earlier, richer version of that legendary composition. This creates a strange collecting category, not discontinued, but no longer reproducible. You can walk into a department store today and buy Chanel No. 5. What you cannot buy is the exact formulation from several decades ago. And that distinction is precisely what drives serious collectors toward pre-reformulation Parfum bottles, sealed boxes, and specific production years. Marilyn Monroe's comment alone turned Chanel No. 5 into cultural shorthand for glamour, but the perfume's staying power goes deeper than one quote. It survived world wars, changing fashion, shifting beauty standards, and nearly a century of competition, remaining one of the best-selling fragrances in history the entire time. For collectors, hunting vintage No. 5 isn't about owning something rare in the traditional sense. It's about owning a specific moment in the story of the world's most famous perfume. A moment that current production, no matter how faithful, can no longer fully replicate. And if a perfume this famous still holds secrets for collectors, imagine what's waiting in the story of a fragrance almost no one has smelled at all. Vintage YSL Opium. In 1977, Yves Saint Laurent released a perfume so bold that some retailers reportedly hesitated to display it. Named Opium, it arrived wrapped in imagery of Eastern indulgence and forbidden luxury, a marketing choice that sparked controversy even as the fragrance itself became a phenomenon. Opium wasn't subtle. It leaned into spice, amber, and a warmth that felt almost dangerous compared to the lighter florals dominating perfume counters at the time. It didn't ask to be liked. It demanded attention, and it got it, becoming one of the defining fragrances of an entire decade. Like Chanel No. 5, Opium has technically never disappeared from shelves, but the version sold today tells only part of its story. Later reformulations softened much of the original's intensity, partly due to changing ingredient regulations, and partly due to shifting consumer tastes that favored gentler, more universally wearable scents. For collectors, this is precisely the appeal. Vintage Opium, particularly bottles from the late 1970s and 1980s, is often described by longtime wearers as a completely different experience from anything currently sold under the same name. Richer, spicier, and noticeably more assertive. It's not simply an old bottle of a modern classic. It's a preserved fragment of a specific, more daring era in perfumery. There's also a broader cultural layer to Opium's story. Its name and marketing drew criticism at the time for its imagery, and that controversy, whether intentional or not, only deepened public curiosity. few fragrances have managed to be simultaneously beloved and debated in quite the same way. As with the other vintage entries on this list, not every old bottle of opium carries real value. Concentration matters. Parfum and eau de parfum versions tend to hold more of the original richness than diluted eau de toilette formulations. Bottle fullness, an intact box, and clear pre-reformulation batch codes all separate a genuine collector's find from an ordinary flea market bottle. Opium proved that a perfume could be provocative and iconic at the same time. But the next fragrance on our list tells a very different kind of story. One about elegance quietly slipping away, formula by formula, decade by decade. Lanvin Arpège. Picture Paris in 1927. Jean Lanvin, one of the era's most respected couturiers, wanted to create a perfume as a gift for her daughter, Marguerite, who was a talented pianist. The name she chose, arpège, comes directly from music, a broken chord, notes played in flowing succession rather than struck all at once. That musical metaphor turned out to be remarkably fitting. Arpège was built as a complex floral aldehyde, a style of perfumery that layered dozens of natural ingredients into something that felt less like a single scent and more like a composition. It became one of the defining fragrances of early 20th century French perfumery, admired for its sheer technical ambition. Over the following decades, arpège went through the same reformulation pressures nearly every historic fragrance eventually faces. Ingredient restrictions, cost considerations, and shifting production methods gradually altered the formula. Each version retained the name and the spirit of the original, but longtime wearers and collectors often describe a noticeable gap between the earliest editions and what's sold today. What makes arpège particularly compelling to collectors isn't just its age. It's the emotional origin story behind it, a mother's gift to her daughter, immortalized in a bottle that would go on to define an entire genre of perfumery. That kind of personal history is rare in an industry often built more around marketing than sentiment. Vintage arpège bottles, especially those housed in Lanvin's iconic black glass with the gold silhouette of Jean and Marguerite dancing together, are sought after both as perfume and as design objects. Collectors look closely at the concentration, the era of production, and whether the packaging matches known vintage runs, since reproductions and later editions can closely resemble the originals at a glance. Arpège reminds us that perfume history isn't only about scent, it's about the relationships and stories bottled alongside it. But our next fragrance carries a very different kind of legacy, one built not on elegance, but on rebellion. Robert Piguet Bandit. In 1944, in the final chaotic days of Nazi-occupied Paris, fashion designer Robert Piguet staged a runway show built around a theme of danger and defiance. Models walked wearing bandit masks, brandishing toy weapons. The perfume created to accompany that show needed to match the audacity of the concept, and perfumer Germaine Cellier delivered exactly that. Cellier was one of the few prominent female perfumers of her era, and Bandit became one of her signature achievements. Built around leather, oak moss, and a sharp green galbanum opening, it was aggressive, smoky, and unapologetically bold at a time when most women's perfumes leaned soft and floral. It didn't try to be pretty, it tried to be powerful. Unlike several entries on this list, Bandit has never fully disappeared. The Robert Piguet brand has changed ownership more than once over the decades, and with each new owner came adjustments to the formula, shifts that longtime wearers have tracked and debated for years across fragrance forums. Even a modern reimagining, released decades after Cellier's original, arrived specifically to reintroduce Bandit's spirit to a new generation, which tells you how much weight this fragrance still carries within the industry. For collectors, the goal isn't simply finding a bottle of Bandit. It's identifying which era of Bandit a bottle represents. The original 1940s formulation, various mid-century and late-century reformulations, and modern reissues can all carry the same name while smelling meaningfully different from one another. Experienced collectors study bottle design, label typography, and production markings almost like historians authenticating a document. Because with a fragrance this frequently altered, precision matters more than nostalgia alone. What keeps Bandit relevant nearly 80 years after its debut is simple. Very few perfumes have ever captured rebellion this convincingly. Long before punk fashion or unisex fragrance became mainstream ideas, Cellier had already built a scent that refused to apologize for itself. The next perfume on our list trades rebellion for something else entirely. obsession, laced quite literally with fire. Caron Poivre. There's a version of this story that begins in a fitting room, but it actually begins in a spice cabinet. In 1954, the French house Caron released a perfume built almost entirely around a single, unglamorous idea. Pepper. Not a whisper of it in the background, but pepper as the star. Perfumer Michel Morsetti built Poivre around clove, carnation, and a wave of black and red pepper accords so intense that even seasoned perfume wearers describe their first encounter with it as startling. Caron itself has one of the more turbulent ownership histories in perfumery. The house passed through several hands over the 20th century, eventually landing under a private investment holding company tied to the Rothschild family. Each transition brought new pressures: commercial, regulatory, financial. And Poivre, like much of Caron's historic haute parfumerie catalog, absorbed the impact. What makes Poivre fascinating to collectors isn't just its intensity, it's what that intensity represents. This wasn't a perfume designed for mass approval. It was designed to be memorable, almost confrontational, in an era when most fragrances aim to soften and please. Caron built a reputation on this kind of fearlessness, releasing what the industry sometimes calls urn scents, pure parfum extracts sold in ornate, amphora-shaped bottles, rather than the everyday spray formats most brands favored. Vintage bottles of Poivre, particularly extrait concentration from Caron's mid-century production, are considered among the more valuable finds in classic French perfumery. Later editions and eventual discontinuations of certain concentrations only deepened collector interest, since fewer authentic bottles remain in circulation with each passing year. As always, condition tells the real story. An unopened, sealed extrait in its original ornate flacon holds significantly more value than a bottle that's been used or improperly stored. Since pepper-forward compositions like this one are especially prone to oxidizing and shifting over time. There's something almost theatrical about Poivre's legacy. It doesn't try to be liked by everyone, and that refusal to compromise is exactly why, 70 years later, collectors still hunt for it with genuine intensity. But if Poivre proved that boldness could become legendary, our next fragrance proved that scandal could become immortal.